Across the earth, the pictorial record which the world had seen of German death camps would not be readily forgotten either.
They arrived at Auschwitz stripped of everything, but one thing defined their fate more than any other: their own body. The camp's meticulous bureaucracy saw prisoners not as people, but as experimental subjects categorized for specific research purposes. But how did this horrific system of medical exploitation actually begin? This documentary traces the chilling transformation of concentration camps into laboratories for racial science and military necessity, revealing the precise organizational structures and ideologies that made widespread experimentation not just possible, but systematic. The system that would enable medical atrocities began not with physicians, but with organizational design. Theodor Eicke's prototype at Dachau established a replicable model for all subsequent camps, creating a standardized framework of control. This structure operated through 5 distinct SS divisions that functioned as a self-contained society with its own rules and hierarchies. At the core stood the protective custody camp, administered by the Totenkopfverbände, the death's head units. These guards maintained constant surveillance over prisoners, enforcing discipline through a regimen of terror. Their presence established an environment where arbitrary punishment became routine, stripping inmates of any expectation of safety or dignity. Within this oppressive structure, the SS implemented the Capo system, selecting prisoners to enforce order among their own. These prisoner functionaries received slightly better rations and privileges in exchange for administering discipline under SS supervision. This created a brutal hierarchy that fragmented prisoner solidarity and transferred much of the daily brutality to inmates themselves. The camp routine reinforced this atmosphere of normalized violence through meticulously enforced rituals. Prisoners endured hours of standing at attention during roll calls, regardless of weather conditions. Forced labor assignments drained physical strength, while psychological torment, through arbitrary rules and punishments, maintained constant anxiety. This systematic brutality served to break individual will and collective resistance. By 1938, this organizational machinery was fully developed and ready for implementation across the expanding camp network. The bureaucratic efficiency achieved at Dachau created ideal conditions for converting human beings into data points. Every aspect of camp administration focused on categorization, tracking, and control of prisoner populations. The framework existed independently of any specific experimental program, waiting only for ideological justification and military necessity to activate its potential. The organizational structure could process human beings as raw material for any purpose the regime required. This system would eventually enable 3 distinct categories of medical experimentation to operate simultaneously across multiple camps, each drawing on the same administrative foundation for subjects, facilities, and security. The laboratory required this precise bureaucratic architecture before any experiments could begin. The organization of these medical atrocities followed 3 distinct axes, each serving different masters and motivations within the Nazi hierarchy. This categorization demonstrates that the experiments were not random acts of cruelty, but a deliberate system with specific objectives. The pattern reveals a calculated approach to exploiting human life for ideological, military, and personal goals. The first axis relentlessly pursued the regime's racial hygiene agenda. These experiments aimed to provide scientific validation for Aryan superiority and develop methods for eliminating so-called undesirable populations. Sterilization studies became a primary focus, testing X-rays, surgical procedures, and various drugs on thousands of prisoners. The objective was to identify a cheap, scalable technique that could be applied to millions without their knowledge. Simultaneously, genetic research sought to isolate the hereditary markers of what the Nazis deemed inferior races. This axis consumed the greatest number of prisoners while producing the least medically useful information. The second axis emerged directly from the demands of the ongoing war. German military branches funded experiments designed to solve battlefield problems and protect soldiers' health. The Luftwaffe sponsored hypothermia research to understand and treat pilots who crashed into cold waters. Other studies tested treatments for malaria, typhus, and combat injuries like bone and muscle damage. These experiments addressed genuine wartime medical challenges, but their methodology, using non-consenting subjects, invalidated any potential scientific value from the outset. The urgency of the war created both the justification and the imperative for this brutal research. The third axis was driven by individual scientific ambition. Certain doctors used the camp system to pursue personal research interests that often straddled the lines between the other two categories. Their work was characterized by a profound disregard for ethical boundaries, leveraging the unlimited supply of human subjects for curiosity-driven investigations. This category lacked the centralized coordination of the others, operating instead through the initiative of individual physicians who saw the camps as a unique laboratory. Each axis drew from different funding sources and institutional support. Racial hygiene experiments found legitimacy through pre-existing eugenics laws and connections to academic institutions. War-related studies received direct military funding and priority access to prisoner populations. Individually driven research operated with varying degrees of official sanction, often relying on personal connections and the general climate of permissibility. The separation of these categories clarifies the systematic nature of the crimes. Understanding that different bureaucratic channels processed requests for sterilization experiments versus hypothermia. Research reveals an administrative machinery capable of servicing multiple concurrent programs of human exploitation. This division of labor allowed specialists in racial theory, military medicine, and pure research to operate within their own domains, insulated from the full scope of the atrocities. The system's efficiency lay in its ability to compartmentalize horror into manageable administrative functions. The ideology of racial purity demanded scientific validation, and the camps provided the human material for this pursuit. Doctors like Karl Klauberg and Horst Schumann transformed medical facilities into laboratories for mass sterilization. Their research sought efficient methods for preventing reproduction among populations, which the regime deemed undesirable. Approximately 700 women underwent sterilization procedures using X-rays or injected caustic substances directly into their uteruses, all performed without anesthesia. These methods caused severe infections, permanent injuries, and numerous deaths. Women who resisted or were deemed unfit for further experimentation often faced immediate transfer to the gas chambers. Other sterilization techniques involved intravenous injections of solutions containing iodine and silver nitrate. These injections produced severe side effects, including vaginal bleeding, abdominal pain, and cervical cancer. When subjects developed cancer, doctors performed vivisections, surgically removing cervixes and wombs for laboratory analysis. X-ray radiation served as another mass sterilization method, with women receiving abdominal exposures and men having their genitalia irradiated for extended periods. After these radiation experiments, reproductive organs were surgically excised without anesthesia for further study. Twin research represented the complementary side of racial science, attempting to prove genetic superiority through comparative analysis. Joseph Mengele's obsession with twins stemmed from his belief they held the key to understanding hereditary traits. His weekly examinations included meticulous measurements of physical attributes and often escalated to unnecessary amputations of limbs. He intentionally infected one twin with diseases like typhus, then transfused blood from the infected twin to the other to study transmission patterns. Many twins died during these procedures, after which their bodies were routinely dissected. Mengele extended his research to prisoners with physical anomalies, particularly those with heterochromia, different colored eyes. He removed the eyes of these living subjects and attempted to change eye color through chemical injections. These ocular specimens were shipped to the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Anthropology, Human Hereditary Teaching and Genetics in Berlin, directed by Dr. Ottmar Freiherr von Verschuur. The institute provided academic legitimacy to these endeavors by receiving and analyzing tissue samples from camp experiments. Medical journals of the era published articles on racial science, normalizing these pursuits within the scientific community. The veneer of legitimate inquiry masked what was essentially mass murder for ideological goals. This axis of experimentation consumed more prisoners than any other while producing the least medically valuable results. The research questions and methods, while aligned with the scientific logic of the time, were executed with complete disregard for human suffering or ethical boundaries. The racial hygiene machine operated with clinical detachment, turning human beings into disposable laboratory specimens in service of a destructive ideology. Josef Mengele embodied the catastrophic fusion of racial ideology and personal scientific ambition. His arrival at Auschwitz in 1943 placed him at the helm of a system perfectly suited to his research program. He exercised absolute authority at the selection ramps, personally sorting new arrivals from the transport. With a mere gesture, he directed individuals toward forced labor, the gas chambers, or his experimental blocks. Mengele maintained a veneer of scientific rigor through meticulous documentation. He conducted weekly examinations of his subjects, recording detailed measurements of eye color, hair color, height, and other physical characteristics across twin pairs. These records created an illusion of legitimate inquiry, but the procedures quickly escalated beyond observation. The experiments progressed from harmless measurements to invasive surgeries, including unnecessary amputations of limbs performed without medical justification. Prisoner doctors found themselves in an impossible ethical dilemma, forced to assist Mengele in these brutal procedures to ensure their own survival. Their complicity was a condition of living another day, a stark choice between professional ethics and personal survival. Mengele exploited this coerced labor to maintain the pace of his research, blurring the line between healer and accomplice. His research interests extended far beyond twins to include dwarfs and individuals with physical anomalies like heterochromia or different colored eyes. He was particularly fascinated by how genetic diseases originated and affected twins, aiming to scientifically distinguish between hereditary traits and those influenced by environment. On individuals with heterochromia, he conducted grotesque ocular experiments, injecting chemicals directly into the eyes of living subjects in attempts to change their color. He then surgically removed these eyes to send as specimens to his academic mentor. Mengele's methods included intentionally infecting one twin with diseases like typhus and then transfusing blood between the siblings to study transmission patterns. Many children died during these procedures. Those who survived the initial experiments were often killed later with chloroform injections directly to the heart, after which their bodies were dissected for further analysis. The drive for academic publication motivated this extensive data collection. He sent tissues and detailed reports to the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Anthropology in Berlin, directed by Dr. Ottmar von Verschuer, seeking legitimacy for his work within the broader scientific community. His experiments on pregnant women involved infecting them with typhoid to observe if the disease would transmit to their unborn children. Forced sterilization experiments using X-rays, surgery, and various drugs were conducted on Jewish and Roma prisoners. The explicit purpose was to develop a method of sterilization suitable for millions of people with minimal time and effort. Mengele's factory of horrors represented the ultimate perversion of the medical profession, where the healer became the killer and scientific curiosity served as a justification for torture. As Germany's military situation deteriorated, the camps became testing grounds for battlefield medicine. The regime justified these experiments as necessary for protecting German soldiers, creating a veneer of utilitarian purpose. This category of research addressed the immediate, practical problems confronting the Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe across multiple fronts. From July 1942 to September 1943, experiments at Ravensbrück concentration camp investigated the effectiveness of sulfonamide, a synthetic antimicrobial agent. Researchers inflicted wounds on subjects and infected them with bacteria, including Streptococcus and Clostridium tetani. To accurately simulate battlefield conditions, they interrupted blood circulation to the wounds. They further aggravated the infections by forcing wood shavings and ground glass into the open injuries. The infections were then treated with various drugs to determine their effectiveness, a process that caused immense suffering and frequent fatalities. The Luftwaffe sponsored a series of experiments specifically designed for its air crews. Beginning in early 1942 at Dachau, high-altitude experiments used a low-pressure chamber to simulate conditions up to 68,000 feet. Of the 200 subjects involved, 80 died outright during these tests. In one instance, documented in a letter from April 5, 1942, a 37-year-old victim was suffocated while doctors observed his reactions. The man began to convulse, lost consciousness, and died 30 minutes after oxygen deprivation was induced. Simultaneously, the hypothermia experiment sought answers for pilots who crashed into cold waters or soldiers fighting on the Eastern Front. Prisoners were immersed in ice water, while doctors recorded their physiological responses to extreme cold. The data aimed to develop effective rewarming techniques. These studies were characterized by their clinical detachment, with researchers focused solely on data points, while subjects suffered and died. From approximately February 1942 to April 1945, malaria experiments were performed on over 1,200 inmates at Dachau. Healthy prisoners were confined in cages with malaria-infected mosquitoes. Once they contracted the disease, they were treated with synthetic drugs at varying, often lethal doses. More than half of the subjects died as a result. In an affidavit presented at the subsequent doctor's trial, SS Obergruppenführer Oswald Pohl referred to the Dachau malaria experiments as the largest experiment, citing it as his reason for protesting to Heinrich Himmler about the continuous requests for more prisoners. These studies possessed the thinnest veneer of medical legitimacy because they addressed genuine military problems. The methodology, however, invalidated any potential scientific value from the outset. The use of non-consenting, malnourished, and traumatized subjects produced unreliable data. The war created both the justification and the perceived urgency for these brutal studies, pushing ethical boundaries beyond recognition in the name of military necessity. The research priorities shifted with the war's demands, but the ruthless exploitation of human subjects remained constant. The Dachau hypothermia experiments merged military necessity with methodical cruelty under SS physician Sigmund Raeder's direction. His team subjected prisoners to carefully controlled freezing conditions, often submerging them in ice water for hours, while recording physiological responses. These studies aimed to establish precise lethal temperature thresholds for Luftwaffe pilots and U-boat crew members who might face extreme cold exposure. The research sought practical solutions that could save German military personnel while disregarding the suffering of those used as test subjects. Researchers maintained detailed records of core body temperature drops, heart rate changes, and survival times under various conditions. They tested multiple rewarming techniques on near-death subjects, including warm water immersion, animal warmth applications, and even body-to-body contact between prisoners. Each method was evaluated for its effectiveness in restoring normal body functions, with researchers noting which approaches showed the most promise for field application. The data collection appeared rigorous, with measurements taken at regular intervals until subjects either recovered or died. The experiments claimed to serve urgent military needs, particularly after German forces encountered severe cold on the Eastern Front. Luftwaffe officials sought better understanding of hypothermia's effects on downed aircrew, while naval commanders wanted solutions for U-boat sailors trapped in freezing waters. This military justification provided a veneer of legitimacy to the research, though the methodology violated fundamental medical ethics. The suffering inflicted on prisoners was considered acceptable collateral damage for potentially saving German lives. Post-war analysis by medical experts revealed critical flaws in both methodology and data. The prisoners used as subjects were already malnourished and physically weakened, making their responses to cold exposure significantly different from healthy military personnel. Temperature measurements were often inaccurate due to inadequate equipment and recording techniques. Subsequent examination of the data suggested probable fabrication in some cases, with results that contradicted established physiological principles. The research ultimately provided little reliable information that could benefit legitimate medical science. The cold precision of these experiments mirrored the camp system's bureaucratic efficiency. Just as administrative offices managed prisoner transfers and supply logistics with detached professionalism, the medical researchers approached human suffering as a data collection problem. The organizational structure that enabled systematic murder also facilitated systematic torture in the name of science. These studies demonstrated how easily ethical boundaries could be overridden when military necessity converged with unlimited human resources and minimal oversight. The suffering inflicted during these experiments far exceeded any potential medical benefit, serving as a stark example of how scientific inquiry becomes corrupted when divorced from moral constraints. From policy to procedure, the next layer was administrative, the bureaucracy of brutality. The machinery of human experimentation required extensive documentation moving through official channels. Research proposals submitted to SS authorities included detailed budgetary requests for equipment and personnel. These applications specified the exact number of prisoners needed, the duration of the studies, and the scientific justification for each project. Itemized requisitions listed laboratory glassware, anesthetics, barbiturates, sutures, X-ray tubes, and replacement parts for sterilization devices. The paperwork converted abstract cruelty into approved administrative action. Camp administrative departments managed the logistical support for these experiments. They processed requisition forms for medical supplies, laboratory equipment, and specialized facilities. The same office that ordered food rations also authorized the procurement of surgical instruments and narcotics. This bureaucratic equivalence between sustaining life and ending it normalized atrocity. Prisoner allocations followed strict protocols, with specific categories of inmates designated for different research programs. Camp commandants held final approval over experimental protocols conducted within their domains. They reviewed research proposals for security implications and resource requirements. Their authorization provided the necessary SS personnel to guard experimental blocks and transport subjects. The commandant's signature transformed a prisoner's status from labor asset to research subject, an administrative decision with lethal consequences. The political department handled the paperwork that finalized this transformation. They maintained the files that tracked each prisoner's status and category. When a researcher requested specific types of subjects, twins, pregnant women, those with particular physical traits, this department identified potential candidates from the camp population. Their records created the paper trail that made targeted experimentation possible on an industrial scale. Medical departments served as the interface between camp doctors and external research institutions. They coordinated the shipment of tissue samples and experimental data to academic centers in Germany. Correspondence between camp physicians and university researchers discussed methodologies and preliminary findings in clinical language. This collaboration gave the experiments a veneer of legitimate scientific inquiry, obscuring their violent reality. Commercial partners entered this chain as well. Auschwitz archives preserve a 5-letter correspondence between researchers and the buyer company, discussing the purchase and delivery of groups of women for pharmaceutical trials. Additional letters from Bayer requested batches of female prisoners for experiments with specific compounds, with prices and delivery logistics negotiated like ordinary supplies. These exchanges show how corporate procurement language grafted onto human lives, treating victims as inventory. This bureaucracy operated with routine efficiency. Requisition forms for laboratory glassware were processed alongside orders for Zyklon B gas canisters. The same administrative machinery that managed camp infrastructure also facilitated mass murder and human experimentation. The system treated these functions as equivalent tasks, each requiring proper documentation and approval channels. The banality of evil appeared in ledgers, memos, and shipping notes. Invoice approvals for medical supplies existed beside authorizations for lethal procedures. Budget calculations for research projects ignored the human cost entirely. The records that survived provide chilling evidence of how ordinary processes enabled extraordinary crimes, and they reveal how, step by step, people were prepared for use. The systematic transformation from human being to experimental subject began the moment prisoners stepped off the transport trains. The process was designed for maximum efficiency and psychological impact. Prisoners were immediately separated from their personal belongings and any remaining family members. This initial separation marked the first step in dismantling their identity and social bonds. Stripping, shaving, and disinfecting procedures served dual purposes beyond mere hygiene. The removal of all body hair and personal clothing eliminated individuality and symbols of cultural or religious identity. The harsh chemicals used in disinfection caused skin irritation and discomfort, reinforcing the prisoner's powerlessness. These rituals were calculated to induce shame and break spiritual resistance, preparing individuals for their new status as anonymous units within the camp system. At Auschwitz, tattooing identification numbers onto prisoners' arms created a permanent bureaucratic identifier. This practice replaced names with digits, facilitating precise tracking and selection. The number became the primary reference in camp records, medical files, and experiment logs. This system allowed administrators and researchers to manage prisoners as inventory, reducing human beings to numerical data points for organizational convenience. The classification system implemented upon arrival determined each prisoner's vulnerability to specific experiments. SS physicians conducted swift examinations that categorized individuals based on age, gender, health status, and physical characteristics. These categories directly correlated with the research programs operating within the camp. The classification was not random but followed a deliberate logic that matched human resources to experimental needs. Jewish prisoners, particularly women, were disproportionately targeted for gynecological experiments. Doctors like Karl Klauber specifically requested Jewish women for his sterilization research, reflecting the racial ideology that deemed them biologically undesirable. These women underwent brutal procedures without anesthesia, their reproductive organs treated as disposable test material for developing mass sterilization techniques. Their suffering was considered incidental to the larger goal of racial purification. Twins and individuals with physical abnormalities were immediately flagged for Joseph Mengele's genetic studies. The selection process for these subjects was highly systematic. Guards and prisoner clerks were instructed to identify and report any twins arriving on transports. People with heterochromia, dwarfism, or other distinctive traits were separated from the general population and routed to special experimental blocks. Their unique physical characteristics made them valuable specimens for hereditary research. Strong, healthy prisoners might be temporarily reserved for forced labor, but they also formed the primary pool for military-related experiments. The hypothermia and malaria studies required physically robust subjects to generate usable data. These prisoners represented a renewable resource for testing the limits of human endurance under combat conditions. Their physical strength made them ideal for experiments simulating the stresses faced by German soldiers. The entire intake process systematically erased individual identity to create anonymous research material. The combination of physical degradation, numerical identification, and categorical sorting transformed people into disposable laboratory assets. This dehumanization was essential for the perpetrators, creating psychological distance that allowed them to perform their duties without confronting the moral implications. Prisoner physicians and clerks working in the administrative offices sometimes manipulated records to protect potential subjects. They might misclassify a twin as a single child or alter medical information to make someone appear less suitable for experimentation. These acts of resistance carried extreme risk, as discovery meant immediate punishment or death. The very bureaucracy designed to enable atrocity contained small points of sabotage by those forced to operate it. This intricate machinery made targeted experimentation logistically possible on an industrial scale. The system could efficiently identify, categorize, and deliver specific human types to various research programs. The organizational precision that managed this flow of human material mirrored industrial supply chain management, Without this bureaucratic infrastructure, the widespread and systematic nature of the experiments would have been impossible to sustain. The transformation of people into data began with paperwork and ended in the laboratory. Prisoner physicians confronted an impossible ethical landscape where medical ethics collided with survival imperatives. These doctors, often imprisoned for their own political beliefs or Jewish heritage, operated infirmaries under strict SS supervision. Their positions placed them at the precise intersection of healing and harm, forcing daily decisions that challenged their professional oath. Figures like Stefan Budziaszek managed camp infirmaries while walking this fine line. Their medical knowledge gave them slightly better chances of survival, but also made them complicit in the system. Some chose cooperation with experiments in exchange for minor improvements in prisoner conditions. A prisoner doctor might agree to assist with blood draws or record-keeping if it meant obtaining extra bandages or preventing the selection of specific individuals for death. This calculated cooperation created moral compromises that haunted survivors long after liberation. Other prisoner physicians engaged in subtle sabotage of the research programs. They falsified experimental data, mislabeled tissue specimens, or deliberately contaminated cultures. A doctor might record incorrect temperature readings during hypothermia, experiments, or swap identification tags on blood samples. These acts required precise timing and carried extreme risk, as discovery meant immediate execution. The sabotage aimed to undermine the scientific validity of the experiments while avoiding detection. The electroconvulsive therapy experiments at Auschwitz illustrate this ethical tension with particular clarity. Prisoner physicians were ordered to construct the equipment under the pretense of providing legitimate psychiatric treatment. They assembled the devices using available materials, knowing their medical skills were being exploited. Once operational, the SS used this same equipment for experimental purposes on Birkenau prisoners, applying electrical currents to study neural responses. The prisoner doctors who built the devices faced the knowledge that their technical work enabled this torture. This dual-use dilemma created gray areas that medical professionals navigated daily. A prisoner doctor might administer a placebo instead of an experimental drug, or deliberately mismeasure dosage levels. Some provided actual medical care to experimental subjects when SS guards weren't watching, treating infections or wounds that resulted from the procedures. These small acts of resistance offered minimal comfort, but represented moral defiance in an environment designed to crush human dignity. A few physicians chose overt resistance despite the near-certain consequences. They might refuse to participate in selections or openly protest experimental protocols. This direct confrontation typically resulted in the physician's own transfer to punishment details or immediate execution. Their sacrifice highlighted the extreme pressure facing those who attempted to maintain ethical standards. The physician's oath to do no harm confronted the brutal reality of camp existence. Medical knowledge became both a liability and a potential tool for limited protection. Prisoner doctors weighed each decision against the likelihood of saving lives versus endangering their own survival. Their experiences reveal how ethical frameworks strain under extreme duress and how professional identity becomes both a burden and a fragile shield in inhuman conditions. These physicians operated in a space where every action carried moral weight, and survival itself required continual negotiation with conscience. The experimentation program operated with the efficiency of a distributed industrial network across the Nazi camp system. Each major camp developed specialized research functions, creating a division of labor that maximized output and minimized logistical overlap. This distribution mirrored the compartmentalized nature of German war production, where different factories manufactured specific components for a larger war machine. Ravensbrück concentration camp became the primary center for surgical and trauma research, focusing predominantly on female prisoners. Under the direction of Karl Gebhardt, Hertha Oberhäuser, and other physicians, the camp conducted brutal bone, muscle, and nerve regeneration experiments. Doctors deliberately fractured limbs, severed nerves, and inflicted severe wounds to simulate combat injuries. They then tested surgical techniques and chemical treatments, often intentionally introducing bacteria like streptococcus and tetanus to study infection. These procedures caused permanent disability and death for the majority of subjects. The camp's specialization in this type of research made it a destination for prisoners transferred from other camps, specifically for these experiments. Sachsenhausen served as a testing ground for chemical warfare agents and military equipment. Prisoners were exposed to mustard gas and other chemical weapons to study their effects on human physiology. Additional experiments tested the limits of human endurance under simulated combat conditions, including forced marches in inadequate footwear to develop better gear for German troops. The research aimed to provide immediate tactical advantages for the Wehrmacht, facing multiple fronts. Buchenwald's research program centered on infectious diseases and pharmaceutical testing. The camp's scientists intentionally infected prisoners with typhus, tuberculosis, and other contagious diseases to evaluate experimental vaccines and treatments. The pharmaceutical company Behringwerke collaborated closely with camp authorities, using prisoners as human subjects for drug efficacy trials. This corporate academic military collaboration exemplified the blurred lines between different sectors of the Nazi state. Natzweiler Struthof in occupied France specialized in experiments on captured resistance fighters and political prisoners. The camp conducted particularly brutal mustard gas experiments, exposing subjects to high concentrations of the chemical weapon. Researchers studied the progression of symptoms and tested various antidotes, with most subjects dying in agony from chemical burns and respiratory failure. The camp's location made it accessible for testing on prisoners captured from French resistance networks. This network extended beyond SS control to include corporate partners. The chemical conglomerate IG Farben provided funding and research objectives for various experiments, particularly those related to chemical weapons and pharmaceuticals. Other companies supplied equipment and logistical support, treating the camp system as a readily available human laboratory. The collaboration created a seamless research pipeline from corporate boardrooms to camp barracks. The system demonstrated remarkable logistical efficiency in managing its human resources. Prisoners were sometimes transferred between camps to participate in specific experiments that matched their physical characteristics or health status. A twin might be sent from Auschwitz to another facility for specialized testing, or a healthy prisoner transferred to Dachau for malaria experiments. This mobility ensured that the right subjects reached the appropriate laboratories. The entire operation mirrored German industrial production methods. Just as factories optimized assembly lines for maximum output, the camp system streamlined the process of human experimentation. Standardized procedures, precise record-keeping, and specialized facilities created a horrifyingly efficient research machine. The scale of this operation demonstrates that the atrocities were not isolated incidents, but rather a coordinated program, leveraging the entire concentration camp network as an experimental resource. The bureaucratic machinery that managed prisoner transfers and camp logistics served equally well in allocating human subjects to various research projects. The existence of data from Nazi experiments presents medical science with an enduring ethical dilemma that remains unresolved decades later. The central question is whether information obtained through such brutal means should ever find application in legitimate research, or whether its use would implicitly validate the methods that produced it. This debate forces a confrontation between utilitarian principles and absolute moral boundaries. In 1990, Dr. Robert Berger published a landmark analysis in the New England Journal of Medicine that critically examined the Dachau hypothermia data. His investigation revealed fundamental scientific flaws that undermined the data's reliability. Berger identified methodological inconsistencies, inadequate control groups, and probable fabrication in the recorded results. His conclusion was unequivocal. The research was not only ethically monstrous, but scientifically invalid. The study demonstrated that the data's questionable origins were matched by its poor quality. Beyond questions of scientific validity lies what some ethicists term blood-stained data. Even if certain findings were technically accurate, they argue, the horrific means of their acquisition creates an ethical contamination that cannot be cleansed. Using such information would represent a form of posthumous exploitation of the victims, benefiting from their suffering without their consent. This position maintains that some knowledge comes at too high a moral cost to ever be utilized, regardless of potential benefits. Other researchers advocate for a more utilitarian approach. They contend that discarding potentially life-saving information constitutes its own ethical failure. If data from hypothermia experiments could improve survival rates for accident victims or military personnel, they argue, refusing to use it would compound the original tragedy. These proponents suggest that using the data with proper contextualization, acknowledging its origins and honoring the victims, might represent a more appropriate response than complete rejection. The debate reflects a deeper conflict between consequence-based ethics and principle-based ethics. Utilitarians focus on outcomes. If using the data saves lives, then that benefit outweighs ethical concerns about its origins. Deontologists argue that certain actions are inherently wrong regardless of consequences, and using unethically obtained data falls into this category. There is no consensus on which approach should prevail in this specific case. Modern research ethics codes have largely settled this question in practice. The Nuremberg Code, Declaration of Helsinki, and Institutional Review Board standards generally prohibit the use of unethically obtained data. These guidelines establish that ethical violations invalidate any scientific value, creating a bright line against utilizing research conducted without consent. The professional consensus leans strongly toward principle-based rejection. Yet the data's continued existence in archives and publications creates an ongoing temptation. Researchers occasionally encounter references to these studies in older literature or find themselves building upon knowledge that may have Nazi-era origins. The dilemma persists particularly in fields like hypothermia research, where the camp experiments represented some of the earliest systematic human studies. This creates a lingering contamination that modern science continues to navigate. The question has no easy resolution. Each position carries compelling arguments and significant drawbacks. The ongoing debate itself serves as a necessary reminder of medicine's ethical responsibilities. The data's existence forces each generation of researchers to confront uncomfortable questions about means and ends, about progress and principle. This enduring challenge represents one of the most complex legacies of the Nazi medical crimes, a permanent ethical shadow over scientific advancement. The doctor's trial at Nuremberg, formerly known as United States of America versus Karl Brandt et al., convened from December 1946 to August 1947. This military tribunal exposed the systematic nature of the medical crimes committed within the concentration camp system to a global audience. For the first time, the full scope of experiments on human subjects was laid bare in a court of law. 23 defendants faced charges including crimes against humanity and war crimes. The prosecution presented evidence detailing specific experimental protocols, from the hypothermia studies at Dachau to the sterilization experiments at Auschwitz. The trial transcripts became a permanent record of the methodologies and outcomes, documenting the precise suffering inflicted in the name of science. Witness testimony described the selection processes, the procedures performed without anesthesia, and the fatal consequences for thousands of prisoners. The judgments delivered on August 20th, 1947, resulted in 7 death sentences, 9 prison terms of varying lengths, and 7 acquittals. Karl Brandt, Hitler's personal physician, and several other high-ranking medical officials were among those condemned to death. The sentences reflected the court's attempt to assign degrees of responsibility, though the outcomes were criticized by some as being too lenient for the scale of the atrocities. The most enduring legacy of the trial was not the punishments, but the creation of the Nuremberg Code. This set of 10 principles established the foundation for modern research ethics. The code directly responded to the abuses documented during the proceedings, mandating that voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. It asserted that experiments should yield fruitful results for the good of society, be based on prior animal testing, and avoid all unnecessary physical and mental suffering. The code specifically established the right of the subject to withdraw from an experiment at any time. It required that the degree of risk never exceed the humanitarian importance of the problem to be solved, and that proper preparations and facilities must exist to protect the subject. These principles were a direct rebuke to the practices revealed during the trial, where prisoners had no agency and were treated as disposable materials. Yet the legal reckoning was incomplete. Many perpetrators escaped prosecution entirely, evading capture or benefiting from the shifting priorities of the emerging Cold War. The trial established a crucial legal precedent that following orders was not a valid defense for medical professionals, emphasizing their duty to ethical conduct above obedience to authority. This principle would later influence subsequent international law regarding medical ethics and human rights. The Nuremberg Code became the ethical framework that governs biomedical research to this day. Its principles were expanded upon by the Declaration of Helsinki in 1964 and are enforced through institutional review boards at research institutions worldwide. The code represents a direct and permanent response to the crimes exposed in the courtroom. The trial forced the medical profession to confront its own capacity for atrocity when divorced from moral constraints. It created a clear boundary between legitimate scientific inquiry and the exploitation of human beings, a boundary drawn from the suffering of the camp's victims. The proceedings demonstrated that legal accountability could produce constructive change, transforming horror into protective principles for future generations. The pursuit of justice for the medical crimes committed in the camps remained profoundly incomplete. Many key figures responsible for designing and implementing the experimental programs successfully evaded capture and prosecution after the war. Their ability to disappear exposed the limitations of the post-war reckoning and the competing priorities that allowed perpetrators to escape accountability. Josef Mengele's escape became the most symbolic failure of justice. Using routes established by clandestine networks, often called the rat lines, he fled Europe and eventually settled in South America. He lived for decades in Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil under various aliases, including José Mengele and Wolfgang Gerhard. Despite international warrants for his arrest, he avoided capture, aided by sympathetic communities in the vast, unmonitored territories. He died in 1979 by drowning after suffering a stroke while swimming off the coast of Brazil. His death meant he never faced a court of law for his actions at Auschwitz. His academic mentor, Ottmar von Verschuer, who had received tissue samples and reports from Mengele's experiments, continued his career in genetics with minimal consequence. After a brief denazification process, he became a professor at the University of Münster, where he directed the Institute of Human Genetics until his retirement. The broader scientific community was slow to acknowledge its own complicity. Many academic institutions and professional medical associations in Germany took decades to formally confront the roles their members had played. A culture of silence and a desire to move forward allowed many to reintegrate into society without facing questions about their past actions. The geopolitical landscape of the emerging Cold War further complicated accountability. Allied intelligence agencies, particularly those of the United States, actively recruited some Nazi doctors for their specialized knowledge. This was part of a broader program, often referred to as Operation Paperclip, which sought to gain a scientific advantage over the Soviet Union. The wartime research on topics like hypothermia, chemical weapons, and aerospace medicine was considered strategically valuable, leading to ethical compromises that prioritized national security over justice. Compensation programs for the survivors of the experiments were established, but proved to be profoundly inadequate. The application process was often labyrinthine, requiring documentation that was impossible for survivors to obtain. The amounts awarded were minimal and failed to acknowledge the scale of the physical and psychological trauma inflicted. For many victims, the lack of meaningful financial restitution compounded the moral injury of seeing their tormentors escape punishment. The failure to achieve full accountability reflects a confluence of factors: the chaos of the immediate post-war period, the strategic imperatives of the Cold War, and institutional resistance within the medical and scientific establishments. Mengele's freedom for over 3 decades stood as a stark reminder of justice delayed and ultimately denied. The pursuit of accountability did not end with the Nuremberg Trials. It continues through the relentless work of historians, journalists, and human rights organizations who work to document these crimes fully. Memorialization efforts, including museums, archives, and educational programs, strive to ensure that the victims are remembered and that the lessons of this dark chapter are not forgotten. This ongoing work represents a continued, if belated, effort to confront a history that many were once content to leave behind. The atrocities committed in the camps forced the medical profession to confront its ethical foundations in a way no previous event had done. Institutional review boards, now mandatory for research at universities and hospitals worldwide, exist as a direct response to these abuses. These committees scrutinize research proposals for ethical compliance before any study can begin. Their authority to approve, modify, or reject projects creates a critical barrier against unethical experimentation. Informed consent procedures specifically address the profound power imbalances exposed in the camps. Modern protocols require that participants receive comprehensive information about a study's purpose, procedures, risks, and benefit. They must voluntarily agree to participate without coercion and retain the right to withdraw at any time without penalty. These safeguards ensure that individuals maintain autonomy over their own bodies, a principle utterly violated in the camp system. Documentation of consent is meticulously recorded and maintained. The World Medical Association's Declaration of Helsinki, first adopted in 1964, expanded and reinforced the principles established at Nuremberg. This international document provides ethical guidelines for medical research involving human subjects. It emphasizes that the well-being of the individual research subject must take precedence over all other interests. The Declaration has undergone multiple revisions to address evolving ethical challenges in research. Bioethics emerged as a distinct academic field, partly in response to these historical events. Universities established dedicated departments to study the ethical implications of medical practice and research. This formal discipline created frameworks for analyzing complex moral questions that arise in healthcare and scientific investigation. The field continues to develop new approaches to balancing scientific progress with human rights. Yet ethical challenges persist regarding vulnerable populations in military medicine. Prison inmates, terminally ill patients, and economically disadvantaged communities remain susceptible to exploitation. The continued development of enhanced interrogation techniques and battlefield medicine testing creates ongoing moral dilemmas. These situations require constant vigilance to prevent the repetition of past abuses. The story of the Nazi experiment serves as a permanent cautionary tale about the dangers of divorcing science from morality. It demonstrates how easily ethical boundaries can be eroded when human beings are reduced to